Few figures in history have cast as dark a shadow as Pol Pot and Joseph Stalin. Both men rose to absolute power in different parts of the world, each with their own vision and ideology, and both unleashed unimaginable horror on their people. Today, we're diving deep into the legacies of these two tyrants. Our goal? To answer the haunting question, who was worse? Was it Pol Pot, the brutal leader of Cambodia's Khmer Rouge, or Stalin, the Soviet dictator who built an empire on blood and fear? Scene 1, the rise to power. To understand the horrors they unleashed, we need to look back to how they seized control. Joseph Stalin was born in poverty, yet his early life as a revolutionary brought him closer to the inner circle of the Soviet Union. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin maneuvered himself into a position of unprecedented power. It wasn't immediate, though. Over years, he outplayed his political rivals, one by one, eliminating anyone who could challenge him. His ascent wasn't just political, it was a ruthless exercise in psychological manipulation. He played friends against each other, gathered intelligence on every rival, and executed those who opposed him. By the early 1930s, Stalin had consolidated power over the USSR. But unlike Lenin's idealistic vision, Stalin was driven by something darker. He wanted to transform the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse, but he had no regard for the lives that would be sacrificed in the process. To him, people were simply cogs in a machine he believed would elevate the Soviet Union to be the world's ultimate superpower. Pol Pot's journey to power was markedly different. Born Saloth Sar, he grew up in Cambodia, eventually studying in France, where he was exposed to radical Marxist ideology. In the 1960s, he returned to Cambodia and became the leader of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, known as the Khmer Rouge. For nearly a decade, he waged a guerrilla war against Cambodia's government. Finally, in 1975, after years of bloody conflict, the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia. Pol Pot didn't just want power, he wanted to erase all traces of the old Cambodia and create a pure agrarian society. It was an idealistic vision, but one that would cost millions of lives. Scene 2, the ideology of total control. Once in power, both leaders sought to impose their will with absolute authority, but their ideologies, while both grounded in communism, took drastically different forms. Stalin's vision was centered on heavy industrialization and military power. He was willing to go to any lengths to achieve this, launching the 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. Factories sprouted up across the nation, and people were thrown into labor, often in brutal conditions. Stalin's motto could have been, progress at any cost, and indeed the cost was immense. Under Stalin, society was reshaped around a culture of fear. Through the Great Purge, Stalin eliminated perceived enemies within the Communist Party, the government, and the general population. He didn't just kill people, he destroyed families, sending husbands, wives, and even children to gulags. This wasn't just about eliminating threats, it was about creating a society where people were terrified to even think about dissent. Pol Pot's approach was even more extreme. He wasn't content with controlling cities or factories. He wanted to turn back time and recreate Cambodia as a completely agrarian society. To do this, he forcibly evacuated cities, moving millions of people into the countryside to work on collective farms. It wasn't just a shift in lifestyle, it was a violent reset of civilization itself. Under Pol Pot's rule, intellectuals, religious figures, and anyone associated with the old world were branded enemies of the state. Even wearing glasses could mark you as an intellectual, a crime punishable by death. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, the slightest suspicion was enough to warrant a death sentence. There was no room for education, modern technology, or even family bonds. Husbands and wives were often separated, and children were taught to report on their parents if they saw any signs of disobedience. Pol Pot believed that loyalty to the state must come before any personal connection. Scene 3, the crimes and death tolls. Both Stalin and Pol Pot left horrifying legacies of human suffering, but let's look at the numbers to fully grasp the scale of their crimes. Under Stalin's rule, millions perished. The Great Purge alone resulted in the deaths of up to 1 million people through executions, forced labor, and starvation in gulags. But the atrocities didn't stop there. One of the darkest episodes was the Holodomor, the forced famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s. Historians estimate that between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians died of starvation, their crops and resources confiscated to feed Stalin's industrial ambitions. And let's not forget the gulags, Soviet labor camps spread across the freezing tundras of Siberia. People sent there faced brutal conditions, performing back-breaking labor in mines, factories, and farms. Survival was often a matter of luck, with millions perishing from exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Pol Pot's Cambodia, while smaller in scale, was equally catastrophic in terms of its impact on the population. In just 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, an estimated 1.7 to 2 million people died, a staggering 25% of Cambodia's entire population. The Cambodian genocide was unique in its speed and intensity. Unlike Stalin, whose rule stretched over 3 decades, Pol Pot unleashed a massacre that consumed his country in less than half a decade. Scene 4. Psychological tactics and torture. Both leaders used unimaginable methods of psychological control and torture to maintain their grip on power. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, were feared across the Soviet Union. Every citizen knew that a single wrong word, even in private, could lead to a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Stalin's regime created a culture of mistrust so intense that people were afraid to speak openly with family or friends. The NKVD encouraged citizens to report on each other, creating a network of informants that reached into every corner of Soviet life. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge went even further. Tuol Sleng, a former school in Phnom Penh, was transformed into a torture and interrogation center. Here, prisoners endured unimaginable suffering. Thousands were tortured into confessing crimes they didn't commit, only to be executed afterward. For the Khmer Rouge, torture wasn't just a means to an end. It was a tool for breaking people down, instilling fear throughout the population. In this prison, known as S21, survival was nearly impossible. Out of thousands brought here, only a handful lived to tell the tale. Scene 5. The Downfall. Stalin's reign of terror eventually came to an end, not by force or uprising, but with his own death in 1953. Stalin reportedly died of a stroke, although some suspect he was poisoned by those close to him who feared his growing paranoia. His death left the Soviet Union in a state of shock, and soon after, Soviet leaders began to distance themselves from his brutal legacy. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, famously denounced Stalin's cult of personality and his crimes in a speech that shocked the nation. Pol Pot, however, faced a more dramatic end. In 1979, Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia, overthrowing the Khmer Rouge and forcing Pol Pot and his followers into the jungle. He continued to lead remnants of the Khmer Rouge from hiding, evading capture for nearly 2 decades. Remarkably, he was never brought to justice for his crimes, living out his last days in a remote area of Cambodia before dying in 1998. His death came without accountability, leaving a wound in the collective memory of Cambodia. So, who was worse, Pol Pot or Stalin? Comparing these two tyrants is difficult because their legacies are both unimaginable. Stalin's policies led to millions of deaths over 3 decades, leaving an enduring mark on Soviet history and affecting countless families across Eastern Europe and beyond. His actions influenced not just his own people, but the course of the 20th century, shaping geopolitics for decades. Pol Pot's reign, while shorter, was so intense that it decimated nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population. His policies obliterated an entire generation, leaving scars that Cambodia still grapples with today. In his pursuit of an agrarian utopia, he destroyed the very fabric of Cambodian society. People who lived through those years recall unimaginable horror, constant fear, hunger, and the knowledge that any misstep could mean death. Both Stalin and Pol Pot remind us of what happens when ideologies turn to extremism and humanity is reduced to a means to an end. It's hard to say who was worse, but perhaps the more important lesson is that unchecked power, fueled by twisted visions, can lead to unthinkable suffering. Thank you for watching, and if you want to learn more about the dark lessons of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for our next episode.